You are listening to the Objects of Affection collection, Study 87, The Thoughtful Middle Distance, Minimalism, the Layered Object, and the End of Aesthetic Binaries in Post-Luxury Design, the Emergence of Minimalism as a Codified Aesthetic Movement in 2025. 2026 presents the post-luxury critical theorist with a precise diagnostic instrument. At its surface, minimalism proposes a third way between the exhausted dispensation of quiet luxury, beige on beige restraint commoditized to meaninglessness, and the compensatory excess of maximalism, which responds to aesthetic fatigue not with depth but with volume. But what minimalism structurally discloses is something far more consequential. A culture-wide migration toward the layered object, an artifact whose richness is not performed at the surface but accumulated through considered depth, material intention, and what the post-luxury conceptual functional art PLCFA framework has long identified as semantic burden. This study argues that minimalism is not an aesthetic trend. It is a structural symptom, evidence that the consumer is groping, without a theoretical vocabulary, toward the PLCFA condition. It is the intuitive recognition that the object must carry more than its surface, that the correct relationship between restraint and richness is not arithmetic, neither too much nor too little but philosophical provenance. The study deploys the PLCFA lexicon, specifically material singularity, semantic burden, atmospheric equity, tactical friction, layered object and custodian's contract, to expose both what minimalism correctly diagnoses and where it structurally fails without PLCFA as its theoretical armature. The exhaustion of the binary. The fashion and design culture of the 2010s and early 2020s organized itself around a single structural opposition, minimalism against maximalism. This binary was never aesthetically neutral. It was ideologically load-bearing. Quiet luxury, which reached peak saturation between 2022 and 2024, encoded not restraint but a specific class performance. The stealth wealth gesture of those who needed no logos because their social position was structurally guaranteed. As OAC documented in Poet Core and Literary Tones, the Transparency Society produced a consumer cohort so exhausted by frictionless perfection that a plus 175% surge in search interest for Poet Core, capes, leather satchels, visible wear, constituted a mass repudiation of the smooth. But the turn to maximalism that followed in 2025 was, from the PLCFA perspective, no correction. It was a sign inversion. Where quiet luxury withheld, maximalism performed. Where quiet luxury was beige, maximalism was fuchsia. But both operated on the same underlying logic, the object as a vehicle for social signaling, the surface as the site of value. The spectacle of dissent and the spectacle of compliance are, from a structural standpoint, indistinguishable. As OAC's study From Function to Fisher demonstrated, the smooth society is not defined by a specific aesthetic register, but by the condition of frictionless surface. And frictionless surfaces can be either minimalist or maximalist. The spectacular transition from one to the other does not rupture the spectacle, it perpetuates it. The correct opposition is not quiet versus loud, it is surface value versus accumulated depth. Minimalism is the culture's first dim intuition of this structural truth. The cultural exhaustion of the binary created the conditions for minimalism's emergence. The term, documented by design commentators since at least 2024, and crystallized as a major interior and lifestyle trend for 2026 by forecasters including Graeber's Trend Update and Adorno Design, describes the middle ground between restraint and excess. Clean-lined foundations layered with moments of personality, negative space calibrated against expressive gesture, austerity never hardened into sterility. What the trend's proponents observe, but cannot name with structural precision, is the intuition that an object's worth is located neither in its silence nor its noise, but in the quality of what it carries. The Eastern structural inheritance minimalism's most rigorous theoretical antecedents are not Western. The movement, whether its practitioners acknowledge it or not, derives its structural coherence from a set of Eastern aesthetic philosophies that have operated in precisely this middle distance for centuries. Understanding minimalism requires situating it within this inheritance, and then identifying exactly what is lost in translation. The Japanese concept of wabi-sabi, finding beauty in imperfection, impermanence, and the incompleteness of things, is perhaps minimalism's most direct philosophical ancestor. Wabi-sabi does not propose a midpoint between empty and full. It proposes that the incomplete is complete. The cracked surface is more beautiful than the flawless one because the crack holds time. This is the philosophical structure that underlies the PLCFA concept of tactical friction. The deliberate introduction of the unsmooth, the resistant, the evidence of having been made, as the primary index of value. The wabi-sabi object does not try to balance aesthetics. It annuls the aesthetic binary altogether by locating value below the surface, in material memory. The Japanese concept of ma, negative space as positive force, offers a second structural key. In Japanese aesthetics, the space between things is not emptiness. It is a field of intentional tension that gives meaning to what occupies it. This is categorically different from minimalism's deployment of negative space as absence, as visual silence, as the luxury of having nothing. Ma is relational and charged. The bowl that is empty is not less than the bowl that is full. It is differently full, full of potential, full of what has been removed with intention. The minimalist practitioner who speaks of thoughtful negative space is reaching for this concept without quite grasping it. Korean aesthetics contribute a third pillar through the concept of Dan-ah, the aesthetic of deliberate simplicity that contains complexity, and through the broader tradition of Korean minimalism that has increasingly influenced Western fashion practice through brands such as Adair Era, Gentle Monster, and the wider Seoul design export that dominated global streetwear's evolution from 2018 onward. The Korean design sensibility operates precisely at the register minimalism seeks, a visual restraint whose simplicity conceals material and conceptual richness rather than advertising it. As OACs study the shadow of the loom documented in the context of semiotic appropriation, the extraction of aesthetic codes from non-Western cultures without carrying their philosophical infrastructure converts depth into surface, which is exactly the risk minimalism runs. Chinese philosophy contributes through Zhongyong, the Confucian doctrine of the mean, not as a compromise but as a dynamic equilibrium, as a state of perfect balance that must be actively maintained rather than merely inhabited. The Guoqiao aesthetic movement, which Heritage identified as a measurable global fashion force by 2026, represents the contemporary Chinese synthesis. Heritage visual codes, ink wash palettes, textile patterns drawn from Tang Dynasty design, silhouettes that echo the Hanfu, combined with the structural vocabulary of global contemporary dress. This is not a compromise, it is layering. It is cultural synthesis operating at the level of deep structure rather than surface quotation. The Western modernity misreading. Western modernity has historically processed Eastern aesthetic philosophy in one of two modes: exoticization or instrumentalization. The Japandi movement, the blend of Japanese minimalism with Scandinavian hygge that dominated interior design from approximately 2019 through 2024, exemplifies the instrumentalization mode. Japandi was philosophically accurate in identifying the resonance between wabi-sabi and Scandinavian lagom, the concept of appropriate measure. But in its market adoption, Japandi collapsed into a commodity aesthetic, neutral linen, pale wood, and abundance of empty surfaces. The Byung-chul Hainian smooth dominated. The Eastern philosophical inheritance, the relational charge of negative space, the beauty of imperfection, the presence of accumulated time in material, was extracted as visual style and discarded as structural content. Minimalism risks the same fate. Its most sophisticated practitioners, interior designers like Sarah Sherman Samuel, whose work design commentators have cited as exemplary minimalist practice, operate at the boundary of material depth and considered surface. But the trend's mass-market coding, as documented in publications from Brit. Co to Homes and Gardens, consistently reduces minimalism to a styling formula: 60% neutral base, 30% secondary accent, 10% bold statement piece. This is route marketing applied to aesthetic doctrine. It extracts the structure of balance and converts it into a quantified prescription, which is precisely what the hollowed object does to the artifact. Strips it of philosophical weight and replaces it with a reproducible visual signature. Minimalism as trending formula is the same structural operation as quiet luxury, as trending formula. The extraction of an aesthetic code from its philosophical substrate, leaving a surface without a foundation. The PLCFA framework diagnosed this mechanism in its study of the white wall paradox. Aesthetic neutrality is not passive. It is an active apparatus for stripping the artifact of its provenance, its labor history, its functional life, converting radical materiality into frictionless speculative capital. When minimalism is operationalized as 60% clean, 40% expressive, It reproduces this mechanism at the level of lifestyle design. The question it cannot answer, because it does not have the theoretical vocabulary, is expressive of what? Expressive of personality, of taste, of mood, or expressive of something structurally more rigorous, of material singularity, of the specific labor history of a specific object, of the burden of having been made by human hands over documented time. Atmospheric equity and the layered object. The PLCFA concept most precisely applicable to minimalism's genuine potential is atmospheric equity, the structural condition of an environment in which every element contributes to a cumulative weight of meaning, rather than competing for individual attention. The minimalist practitioner's instinct toward nothing feels overly streamlined or too matchy-matchy, yet everything comes together perfectly, as Marie Claire's fashion editor Christy Tyler described her own layered aesthetic practice in 2025, is an imprecise but genuine groping toward atmospheric equity. The intuition is sound. An environment, whether a room or a dressed body, should carry a coherent semantic burden distributed across its elements rather than concentrated in a single signature piece. This is the structural logic of the layered object, an artifact or an aesthetic environment whose depth is not visible in any single reading. It rewards sustained attention. It accumulates meaning with proximity. The PLCFA study, The Algorithm of the Hand, identified this quality in the work of Carol Christian Pohl, whose injected dyeing process produces a surface that reads as monochromatic from distance but reveals, at the haptic register, a topographic record of material transformation that cannot be photographed, only held. This is tactical friction at its most architecturally sophisticated, a surface that refuses to yield its meaning at the speed of the image, that demands the slow movement approach of sustained inhabitation. Alan Villa's embroidered ephemera, examined in OAC's dedicated study, constitute perhaps the most formally rigorous examples of the layered object in contemporary practice. The skeletonized leaf substrate carries the accumulated time of biological process, growth, senescence, decay, upon which Villa deposits the accumulated time of hyperlaborious needle painting. The result is an object that layers 4 distinct temporal registers: geological time, the material conditions that produce the biome; biological time, the life cycle of the specific leaf; historical time, the tradition of embroidery as cultural practice; and individual time, Villa's own labor, countable in hours. This is not minimalism, but it is the structure toward which an intellectually rigorous minimalism must aspire if it is to transcend trend status. Atmospheric equity is not balance. It is the structural condition in which every element of an environment contributes to a cumulative philosophical weight rather than competing for surface attention. The layered object as anti-commodity commitment. Minimalism's most significant contribution to post-luxury discourse is not its aesthetic proposition, which is, as we have argued, philosophically derivative without adequate acknowledgement of its Eastern sources, but its market signal. The codification of minimalism as a design trend corresponds precisely with what multiple market observers have identified as the exhaustion of both aesthetic extremes as signaling mechanisms. Source Fashion's Womenswear Strategy 2026 documented that searches for designer logo items had dropped nearly 30% by 2025. The spectacle of status by brand was losing semiotic traction. At the same time, the maximalist counterswing was producing its own fatigue. The spectacle of excess had been consumed too rapidly to sustain. What the market is registering, and minimalism is naming, however imprecisely, is the shift from accelerated luxury to deep materiality. This shift was documented in OAC's study of poet core and literary tones, which argued that the plus 175% surge in poet core search interest constituted a structural migration. Consumers fleeing the architecture of smoothness for objects with labor density, visible process, and the proof that human time had been compressed into material form. Minimalism's 2026 crystallization as a trend, simultaneously in fashion, interior design, and product aesthetics, confirms that this migration is not subcultural but systemic. The PLCFA framework calls this migration by its proper name: the anti-commodity commitment, the structural refusal to allow the object to function as a sign vehicle in the market's circulation of status. The minimalist practitioner who chooses a handmade ceramic over a mass-produced vessel, who layers a vintage textile against a contemporary tailored form, who invests in a piece whose value is not immediately legible at social speed, is performing, without theoretical consciousness, an act of anti-commodity commitment. The commitment is intuitive rather than structural. The PLCFA framework's contribution is to give it structure, to make it contractual, to anchor it in the custodian's contract, the formal obligation that converts aesthetic preference into ethical practice. Guoqiao and the syntax of the synthesized object, the most structurally sophisticated contemporary expression of what minimalism is reaching toward, is not Western at all. The Guoqiao movement, New Chinese style, represents the most advanced current synthesis of Eastern philosophical depth with the structural vocabulary of Western modernity. Heritage February 2026 data confirmed Guoqiao's transition from a regional identity statement to a measurable global fashion force. Gen Z's renewed focus on cultural origin, combined with the design infrastructure of Shanghai and Beijing's contemporary fashion scenes, has produced a design language in which Tang Dynasty silhouettes, ink wash palettes, and calligraphic textile patterns operate not as citations, but as material memory, as evidence of a cultural depth that has genuinely accumulated over centuries of practice. Guoqiao succeeds where Western minimalism tends to fail because it does not encounter its layering as a styling decision. The layering is structural. It is the condition of a living practice negotiating between its own inherited depth and the formal demands of contemporary global culture. A Guoqiao garment that combines a contemporary technical fabric with a hand-embroidered pattern drawn from Song Dynasty textiles, is not balancing minimalism and maximalism. It is enacting a custodian's contract with its own cultural inheritance, a commitment to carry the weight of the historical object forward into the functional present. This is precisely what the PLCFA framework means by narrative permanence, not the preservation of the past as archive, but its activation as living structure. Guoqiao does not balance aesthetics. It enacts a living custodian's contract with centuries of cultural inheritance. This is the condition toward which minimalism reaches, but cannot achieve without a structural PLCFA armature. The Japandi synthesis that preceded minimalism extracted Eastern aesthetic codes without carrying their philosophical infrastructure. The Guoqiao movement refuses this extraction. It insists on maintaining the philosophical weight, the semantic burden, of the specific cultural objects it draws upon. This insistence is what gives Guoqiao its structural integrity and what distinguishes it from mere cultural synthesis as trend. As OAC documented in The Shadow of the Loom, the extraction of aesthetic codes from their cultural substrate, what OAC terms semiotic primitive accumulation, is the founding operation of the luxury apparatus. Guoqiao's resistance to this extraction is in structural terms a PLCFA practice, the assertion that the object's value is inseparable from its provenance, its labor history, and its continuing cultural obligation. Where minimalism fails, the problem of the curatorial self. The most common contemporary articulation of minimalism is the doctrine of the curated self, the individual who assembles a personal environment from objects that reflect their personality and tell their story, selected with intention from a range of styles, periods, and influences. This is the formulation Adorno design offers as minimalism's core tenet. Personal expression without going to extremes, living spaces that are complex and multifaceted, because people are complex and multifaceted. From the PLCFA perspective, this formulation reproduces the fundamental error of the hyperreal consumer landscape. It positions the object as a vehicle for self-expression rather than as an entity with its own moral and material weight. The object that tells my story is still fundamentally an object that serves the consumer's identity performance. It is a more sophisticated sign vehicle than the logo bag. It requires curatorial effort, taste literacy, and cultural capital to deploy, but it remains a vehicle. The PLCFA framework insists on a structural inversion, the object that carries its own story, regardless of whose possession it enters. The object testimony is primary, the custodian's narrative is secondary, derived from their relationship with the object's already existing moral weight. This distinction is not pedantic. It has structural consequences for how value is located. If the object's worth derives from the curator's selection, from taste, then its value is portable. The same object in different hands carries different worth. This is the logic of the art market, and its patronage validation mechanism as OAC analyzed in The Cost of Stewardship. If, by contrast, the object's worth derives from its own material and historical constitution, from its moral weight per material, then the curator's role is transformed from selection to stewardship. The question is no longer what does this object say about me, but am I adequate to the obligation this object creates? The remainder of this study continues at objectsofaffectioncollection.com. This has been a study from the Objects of Affection collection, a critical art research institution operating under the framework of post-luxury conceptual functional art. Read the full research at objectsofaffectioncollection.com.